Thank you. I have two questions. The first one, I'm fascinated by Halhed. I mentioned this, of course you are. Where was he coming from? Because every school child in this country learns that beef came from the Normans, the word for beef, right? It comes from boeuf, and we learned the etymology of English words and how it's influenced by the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans and everyone else. So what made him think that there should be a pure, unadulterated version of Bengali? So sort of the context on that. And then the second question, I'd like to learn more about the Meli Bhasha. I don't know if I missed it when I went out for a phone call, but if you...
No, I didn't talk
okay, I'd love to hear more about that.
I have a whole chapter in the book about Meli.
Okay, thank you.
It's not asking you to go buy my book, but
no,
what I'm saying is I do. This is one of the chapters that I concern myself with in that project.
I'll read the book, but now maybe the intersection between class and gender.
I would definitely like to comment about that. Okay. To begin with, I don't think Halhed was particularly bothered about explaining etymology, although it's quite clear that his inspiration comes from the Orientalist scholars of the time, for whom Sanskrit was the lingua franca of ancient India. So that's the connection he's making it, but he doesn't bother to explain the etymology. Carey to a certain extent does, but Halhed not so much, because he's quite convinced that he's doing the right thing, as we can see through his working papers. That is the mentality which is at work. The other question, which is about gender and
class, the Meli Bhasha
and class. Again, this is the same kind of narrative of how social groups who are in power, which obviously men, have a very clear agenda of shaping a kind of self-respect for the Bengali Bhadralok. So this is kind of the genteel literary Bhadralok, and this is self-image that they create of themselves, which is in a sense very artificial, and in the process of the creation of this genteel language, they displace the burden of the colloquial onto women and lesser social groups. So this is part of that bigger process of the shifting of the burden, even though quite clearly men also spoke that language. But in accounts of the period, not just from your European scholars, but even Bengali reformists of the time and linguists of the time, this is not the language we speak. This is the language of the Antapur. Okay. This is the language that women speak. It's idiomatic. It's irrational. This is very different from the language of the modern prose of the reformists. Vidyasagar and Ramon. So this is the language that matters because it has an agenda, and it's a language we can be proud of. So Bengali is shaped into this vehicle of larger social discourses of the time, which Bengalis can be proud of. So they have nothing to do with Meli Bhasha. But the interesting thing, of course, is that this is in the very late 19th century. These are precisely the strands that come back into literary writing, because the Bhadralok realized the inauthenticity of their own project. They realized that they can't be speaking for the masses if they're not speaking their language. So it's interesting to see in the late 19th century how all these strands actually come back, but not the Musalmani Bengali.
Thank you. I had a question about this very Sanskritic Bengali that you were talking about, and its history later in the 19th century. I was wondering if you can speak a little bit about how it may relate to Arya ideology and the idea of reformists, certainly elsewhere in India. I'm aware of the reorientation along sort of these very Sanskritic principles is what's required for India's reawakening. Yeah. The relationship between Arya ideology and the Sanskritic Bengali, if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, it's not something that I have found linguists consciously talk about in the prefaces to the works, or the works that I have looked at. It's clearly at the back of their minds, because they're taking on the model that is being produced by the Orientalist scholars of the time, people like Halhed and Max Muller and so on. So a whole range of that body of works is inspiring them. This is the identity that they want to pick up. So yes, they're working along those lines, even though the linguists, I don't think they concern themselves very visibly with that discourse. But this is the discourse that they're working it. There's no denial of that.
Could you give some examples of Nasihat Namas? That's one. And second one is, when did this writing of Bengali from right-hand side to left-hand side and binding on the right-hand side, did it ever start? If it did, when did it get disbanded?
Okay, the first is I don't have any examples of Nasihatnamas with me today.
By name?
Well, I honestly, it's not something I have. I referred to some works, didn't I? Or maybe they're not here, but there's no doubt that this is a very big body of literature, which is dominating this period. And Rafiuddin Ahmed's work, I think, would be the best. I can channel you in that direction because this is not something I have worked with, but it's well known and it's a big body of literature. To your second question, I think this is about the 1860s, 1870s onward that we find the binding of the book in that fashion. Even though I think you would find isolated examples in the 1850s, but this is also, we don't know if this had happened earlier because 1850s onwards is the period that we are actually tracing the publishing industry and you have records of it. Prior to 1850s, you don't have that many records. I wouldn't know if it had happened earlier on, but because of the fact that 1850s onwards, we have very good records of these publications. It's possible they had existed earlier, but for me, I've been able to trace them only from that period.
And when did
it stop is a very good question. I don't know whether, even up to the early 20th century, and I've looked at old bookshops in Calcutta, and I've found works of this kind being printed even in the early 20th century. Maybe, some of you can tell me. I don't know when it stopped.
I can interrupt and tell you about the Nasihatnamas.
Oh, good.
Nasihatnamas are a body of literature. They were produced by the people who wrote wills. The Muslim property is to be divided into what can wife get, what can the children get, what can the nephews get and the nieces get. And if nobody left any boys, then the distribution was completely different according to the Quran. And these used to be written by the munshis or the solicitor-like people. They were called muhoris. So these Nasihatnamas were not books, they were wills, and which were collected later on to see how Muslim Bengali developed.
But this is also didactic literature, isn't it? It's the spreading of religious messages.
What this doctor is dealing with is the early time. We didn't have colleges and academies at that time. We had tolls. Tolls were the schools, little schools, where there were few students, and the tolls were run by one Brahman. One Brahman used to run a toll, and he had a few people. Same way the munshi, one munshi used to teach in a mosque, and few students. So we didn't have academies or Oxford and Cambridge at that time. That was 1900 and early time. Before the division of Bengal, before the division of Bengal into two parts. That is the period this doctor is dealing with. So these schools were tolls and maktabs, not schools and colleges. And that's why you don't have a great big body of literature. You have a small body of literature, but definitely there were the strands of Muslim, how Bengali was being developed under the Muslims, the way the Bengali language was developing in the tolls under the Brahmins. And then there were the missionaries who come in with their printing machines. And this gentleman who wrote the first Bengali grammar book, he was a missionary man. He wanted to know the language, and he had two munshis. He had an Arabic Persian munshi teaching him Bengali, the Muslim version of Bengali, and then he had another munshi, a Hindu gentleman, who was teaching him the Sanskritized Bengali. So, and he was really confused, very confused, poor fellow.
Can I just add to that? I think two things. One is Khaled was not a missionary, but he was helped by the two people that you mentioned. And the second is that The nasihatnamas were also very instructive and didactic, so they would tell people how to lead the true Islamic way of life. I thought what you meant was you wanted examples, didn't you? You wanted titles of nasihatnamas. Yeah, but they have specific titles. So nasihatnamas would have come by name. They would have titles. I didn't have titles, but they are very instructive, didactic literature, telling how a true Muslim should lead his or her life.
We go to a different one.
Thank you for the talk. It's extremely educational. But I just want to ask you, Warren Hastings' role, because he played a very significant role at that time, and he was the first scholar, and he knew about Portuguese very well. Why? And even Mills, when he's criticizing Warren Hastings, he praised that he knows the Bengali people, ordinary people, and he knows the culture of the people. Why did he get involved? Because all these people are his associates, Khaled and others. They're all from Warren Hastings. Why did he do that? Is it mainly because building of Calcutta as a capital, he wanted to urbanize the whole thing? What is the motive for developing Bengali language? He supported to bring all these pundits to come together. So what is the significance for Warren Hastings? What did he do there?
Okay, good question. I think for this we have to just step out of the project of the Bengali language a little and look at the wider project that Hastings was involved in, because he's the pioneer of Orientalist scholarship in India. And this is to do with the political economy of the East India Company, which decided to invest in the Indian people for purposes of trade. So Orientalist scholarship itself should be seen as stemming out of the political economy of the period, and Bengali is just part of that. So it is important to know the local languages in order to administer them well, in order to get to know them well, because it's good for commerce and good for trade. So Hastings, in his capacity as the Governor General of Bengal, brings in this scholarship, brings in this whole body of scholars. Bengali is just part of it. So that is, Hastings is coming in from the, he wasn't an altruist, even though I think people imagine him to be, but he was coming in as an administrator, because this is why he had been vested with that power, and he had to do.
14 years before he got the responsibility. He was in India for 14 years before he got the East India Company's responsibility.
Which is why perhaps he was the best man to do the East India Company job, because this is what the East India Company wanted to invest in at that time. So this is part of, we have to appreciate that Bengali was part of that wider project. And learning not just Bengali but other local languages were also important for the purposes of revenue collection and commerce and trade and so on. So once again, which is why the involvement of the colonial state is so important. And as a historian, that is very important for us, instead of just looking at Bengali language in isolation, but to see it as part of historical developments and processes. So that's my answer to your question.
We're running out of time, but we'll take 3 questions and we together.
Yeah.
First Kamal, then you, then you.
Thank you for your talk. Are there any opposition of this artificial construction? I heard there are some opposition within the scholars and pundits. They tried to reverse the situation of they created literature against this artificial construction. Are there any examples, or are there any opposition of this artificial construction?
Do you want me to take all the questions?
This lady.
You talked about the syncretic tradition of Bengali in the 18th century, and then how it got split along class lines and religious lines. And I appreciate your research stops in 1905, around that period, and this lady over here spoke about somebody whose research stops in the 1930s. But I was wondering, given that Bangladesh was founded in the 1970s,